The distress signal came through the void like a scream in the darkness. Commander Vex sat in the Galactic Council chamber and listened to the desperate transmission for the third time that cycle, his forehands trembling as the Velic voice crackled. Through the speakers with growing panic and fear, "This is Mining Colony Velic 7, calling any galactic forces in range." The voice said between bursts of static and the sound of explosions in the background, "We are under attack by the Kresh swarm, shields failing, requesting immediate military assistance. Repeat, we need help now." The council members shifted in their seats and exchanged glances that spoke of concern, but also of careful political calculation that had governed the galactic community for 10,000 years of relative peace. Ambassador Quillen from the Veshan Protectorate raised one of her crystalline appendages and spoke in the melodious tone. Her species was known for across 100 systems. The nearest peacekeeping fleet is 4 weeks away at standard cruise velocity, she said while consulting the holographic display that floated before her elongated form. "Protocol requires we submit a formal request for military intervention and wait for the security committee to convene." Dex felt his twin hearts sink, because he knew what for weeks meant for the Velic colony and everyone trapped there under the guns of the most brutal pirate confederation in known space. The Kresh swarm had terrorized the outer systems for decades and left nothing but ash and bones in their wake wherever they went, hunting for plunder and slaves. "How long can their shields hold?" asked Counselor Vren, and his scaled face showed the same helpless frustration that Dex felt burning in his chest. "According to their last transmission, maybe 48 hours, replied the military analyst, whose name Vex could never remember, despite working with him for cycles. "After that, the Kresh will breach the colony habitats and, well," the analyst did not need to finish that sentence because everyone in the chamber knew what the Kresh did to colonies they captured, and none of it was pleasant to contemplate. Thought of the Velic people and their gentle nature that had never known war in their entire evolutionary history, because their homeworld had been a paradise of mild weather and abundant resources. They were herbivores who stood barely a meter tall and whose idea of conflict resolution involved lengthy meditation and carefully composed poetry about mutual understanding. They would not last 5 minutes against the Kresh warriors who filed their teeth to points and wore the bones of their victims as trophies of conquest. "Perhaps we could authorize a fast courier to deliver a diplomatic message requesting the Kresh stand down," suggested another council member whose species Dex found difficult to identify in the dim lighting. They all preferred the Kresh. "Do not respond to diplomacy," he said, and his voice came out harsher than he intended, but the frustration was building to unbearable levels. "They respond to strength and fear, and nothing else matters to them." The council chamber fell silent, except for the continuing distress signal that played on repeat, like an accusation against all of them sitting in comfortable seats while people died light years away. Then something unexpected happened that would change everything. The communications officer burst into the chamber without requesting permission first, and her face showed excitement,
Yes.
mixed with what looked like concern or possibly fear. "Honored council members," she said while trying to catch her breath from running down the long corridors, "we have received a response to the Velic distress call." Dix felt hope surge through him like electricity through a conductor, and he leaned forward in his seat. "Which fleet?" asked Ambassador Quellen, and her crystalline body actually seemed to brighten with relief. "Did the Arxon Defense Force manage to redirect their patrol group?" The communications officer shook her head, and her expression became even more complicated. "No, Ambassador," she replied while pulling up the transmission data on her portable display. The response came from a human patrol group, the UTCN Indomitable Battle Group under Captain Alina Vasquez. The chamber erupted into shocked murmurs, and several council members actually stood up from their seats in alarm. Thex felt his own reaction mirror theirs, because humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, and their reputation preceded them like a shockwave through still water. They came from Earth, which the xenobiologists had classified as a Class 12 death world, where everything from the weather to the microbial life tried to kill you with ruthless efficiencies. Somehow, humans had not only survived on that hellish planet, but had thrived and built a civilization and then reached for the stars with the same Aggressive determination they applied to everything else humans, said Counselor Vren, and his scaled face had gone pale, which Thex had not known was possible for his species. How close are they to the Velic system? The communications officer checked her display, and then looked up with an expression that suggested she could hardly believe the numbers herself to standard days at their current velocity. Captain Vasquez says they picked up the distress call while on deep space patrol and have already altered course to days, whispered Ambassador Quillen, and her voice had lost all its musical quality. They could actually reach the colony in time. We must order them to stand down immediately, said another council member whose name Thex definitely did not know. Humans are far too aggressive for a delicate situation like this, and their combat doctrine violates at least a dozen galactic conventions on proportional response. Thex felt anger rise in him like lava from a volcanic vent, because here they were, again talking about protocols and conventions while people died screaming into the void. Captain Vasquez has not requested permission, the communications officer said, and now her expression definitely showed fear. She sent a courtesy notification that they are responding to the distress call and will engage any hostile forces threatening the colony. She cannot do that without council authorization, Ambassador Quellen said, and her crystalline form actually pulsed with indignation. There are procedures and chains of command and diplomatic considerations. Dex stood up from his seat, and his voice came out louder than he had ever used in the dignified council chambers. The Velic will be dead before we finish debating procedures, he said, and felt every eye turn toward him. The humans are offering to help, and we should accept you do not understand what you are suggesting, said Counselor Vren, and his voice carried the weight of long experience. Human military responses are not like ours, and they do not believe in measured force or proportional escalation. Perhaps that is exactly what this situation requires, Dex replied, and sat back down because his legs were shaking from the adrenaline. Council continued to debate and send messages and draft formal objections to human intervention while the distress signal from Velic 7 continued to play. Its desperate pleas somewhere in the darkness between stars the human battle group was. It's already accelerating toward the besieged colony at velocities that would make most species unconscious from the gravitational stress. Captain Lena Vasquez sat in her command chair aboard the UTCN Indomitable and listened to the Velic distress call one more time before turning to her tactical officer. Time to weapons range, she asked. 47 hours at current acceleration, ma'am. The officer replied. Push it to 5, Vasquez said, and her dark eyes were hard as steel. I want to arrive before those pirates think they have time to finish what they started. The crew will feel that extra acceleration, Captain. The crew signed up to save lives, Vasquez said, and stood from her chair. 2 hours of discomfort versus thousands of dead colonists is not a difficult calculation. She walked to the forward viewport and stared at the stars rushing past as the Indomitable pushed toward combat. Velocity behind her, the bridge crew worked with practiced efficiency, and no one questioned the order because they all understood what was at stake. The Galactic Council could debate and draft objections all they wanted, but Captain Elena Vasquez had made her decision. The moment she heard that distress call, someone needed help, and she was going to provide it with fire and fury if necessary. Pirate Lord Krathik stood on the bridge of his flagship Bone Render and watched the Velic colony shields flicker and pulse like a dying star. His scarred face split into a grin that showed all his filed teeth because he knew victory was only hours away now, and then the real fun would begin. How much longer until their shields collapse? He asked his tactical officer while scratching at the dried blood still crusted on his ceremonial armor from their last raid. 6 hours, maybe 8 at most, the officer replied while studying the sensor displays with professional interest. Their power generation cannot sustain the defensive grid much longer. Krathix nodded and turned to survey his fleet through the forward viewport where 40 Kresh vessels surrounded the small mining colony like sharks circling wounded Pratha. Kresh Swarm had built its reputation on raids. It's exactly like this one because colony worlds on the frontier had minimal defenses, and the Galactic Council moved too slowly to ever mount an effective response. By the time any peacekeeping force arrived, the Gresh would have stripped the colony of everything valuable and disappeared into the vast emptiness between civilized and elicitive systems. Send another demand, Krathix ordered, and his voice carried the casual cruelty that had made him feared across a dozen sectors. Tell them to surrender now, and we will kill only half the population instead of all of them. The communications officer transmitted the message, and they all waited to see if the Velik would finally break under the weight of hopeless terror instead. Something unexpected appeared on the long-range sensors. "Sir, we have multiple FTL signatures dropping into the system," the tactical officer said, and his voice had lost its confident tone. Reading 7 vessels unknown configuration, Krathix moved to the sensor station and stared at the display with growing irritation because interruptions were bad for business. Galactic peacekeepers. He asked, "No, sir. The drive signatures do not match any known Council fleet patterns," the officer replied while pulling up detailed scans. Running identification protocols now. Computer systems churned through their databases and then delivered an answer that made every Kresh warrior on the bridge freeze in sudden uncertainty. "Ships are identified as human origin, sir," the tactical officer said, and his clawed hands actually trembled on the controls. "United Terran Colonial Navy Battle Group Designation, UTCN, Indomitable." Krathix had heard stories about humans like every pirate and raider who worked the frontier. Regions where the Deathworlders were slowly expanding their territory. They were the species that had somehow survived on a planet so hostile that galactic xenobiologists still argued about how intelligent life had emerged there at all humans fought wars with each other for thousands of years before they even reached space, and their idea of acceptable casualties made veteran Council military officers physically ill. 7 ships against our 40, Krathix said, and forced his voice to sound confident even though something cold had settled in his chest. Even Deathworlders cannot overcome those odds. He opened a general transmission to the approaching human fleet and let all the contempt he could muster drip from his words. "Human vessels, this is Pirate Lord Krathix of the Kresh Swarm," he said while his crew listened with approval. "You are entering a combat zone where you have no authority or jurisdiction, so turn around and leave while you still can." The response came back almost immediately in a flat, emotionless voice that somehow carried more menace than any amount of shouting could have achieved. "This is Captain Alina Vasquez of the United Terran Colonial Navy," the humans said, and Krathix could hear the bridge noise of an active warship behind her words. "You are hereby ordered to stand down and surrender because you have attacked a sovereign colony under galactic protection, and we are authorized to use lethal force." Krathix laughed, and his officers joined in because the audacity was almost impressive. "You have 7 ships, little human, and we have 40, he replied while signaling his tactical officer to begin targeting solutions. "Your bravery is admirable, but your mathematics need improvement. Final warning," Captain Vasquez said, and her voice had not changed at all. "Power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded or we will open fire." Krathix cut the transmission and turned to his crew with a sneer. "Show these Deathworlders what happens when they interfere with the Kresh Swarm," he ordered and pointed at the sensor display. "All ships open fire and destroy them." The Kresh fleet opened fire with everything they had and 40 ships worth of plasma cannons and missile batteries lit up the darkness like an artificial Synchrotix. Watched the tactical display and waited to see the human ships scatter or try to retreat, because that was what every other species did when faced with overwhelming firepower. Human fleet did not scatter or retreat. Instead, they accelerated directly toward the Kresh formation at velocities that made the sensor officer check his instruments twice to make sure they were reading correctly. "Sir, they are moving at combat speed of 0.4 c," the officer said, and his voice cracked with disbelief. That acceleration should kill their crews from the gravitational stress. "Apparently humans have different standards for what kills them," Krathix said, and felt the first real flutter of concern. The human ships plowed through the incoming fire with their point defense systems, tracking and destroying missiles with precision that suggested computer targeting far more advanced than anything the Kresh possessed. Their shields flared under the plasma barrage, but held with surprising strength, considering how much firepower was being directed at them. Then human ships returned fire, and Krathix learned his first lesson about Deathworld military doctrine. Human weapons did not rely on energy shields or carefully calibrated plasma streams because humans had evolved on a planet with deep gravity wells and thick atmospheres. They built kinetic cannons that violated 3 different galactic weapons treaties by accelerating solid projectiles to relativistic velocities. The first human salvo punched through the Kresh formation, like bullets through paper in 2 pirate vessels. Simply ceased to exist as railgun rounds traveling at significant fractions of light speed. Turned them into expanding clouds of superheated debris, evasive maneuvers. Krathix shouted, but it was already too late because the human ships were among them now. UTCN destroyers moved with predatory grace and impossible agility as their crews pulled maneuvers that would have killed any other species from the GI forces. Alone human pilots had evolved to track fast-moving prey and process high-speed combat data, because their ancestors hunted on a death world where mistakes meant extinction. Krathix watched his tactical display dissolve into chaos as the human ships tore through his fleet with systematic efficiency. Did not engage in the traditional galactic style of long-range shield attrition or careful positioning. For advantage, they simply identified targets and destroyed them with weapons that hit harder than anything the Kresh had ever encountered. Return fire, concentrate all batteries on the lead human ship. Krathix ordered, but his voice had lost its confident edge. The Kresh vessels tried to focus their firepower, but the human ships were never where the targeting computers predicted they would be. Their evasion patterns defied logic because no ship should be able to change velocity that quickly without tearing itself apart. 5 more Kresh vessels went dark as human missiles streaked through their shields and detonated. With nuclear fury, the humans were not even using their full arsenal yet, and already a quarter of the Kresh fleet was crippled. Ordestroed Krathix realized with growing horror that he had made a terrible mistake. He had assumed human ships would fight like galactic vessels with careful, measured responses and proportional escalation. Instead, the humans fought like apex predators. From a world where everything tried to kill you, and the only response that mattered was overwhelming violence. All ships retreat to Rally Point Gamma. Krathix ordered, and his hands clenched on the command throne. We need to regroup, but the human fleet was not interested in letting them regroup. The destroyers broke formation and pursued individual Kresh vessels with relentless determination. Captain Vasquez's voice came over the open channel again, and this time there was something almost sad in her tone. You were warned, she said simply. Then the human flagship opened up with its main batteries, and the bone render's shields collapsed under the assault craft. It felt his ship shake and heard the screams of his crew as bulkheads ruptured and atmosphere vented into space. The last thing he saw before the emergency systems kicked in was the human fleet systematically destroying everything he had built over decades of raiding. The Velic colonists huddled in their shelter and watched their sensor displays in stunned disbelief as the massive Kresh fleet that had been bombarding them for days was torn apart in less than an hour. The human ships moved through the battlefield like dancers and left only wreckage in their wake. One of the Velic elders turned to his companions with his large eyes wide in shock. What kind of species fights like that? He whispered. Deathworlders. Another replied, and his voice carried equal parts terror and gratitude. The kind that answered our call when no one else would. Commander Sarah Chen sat in the cockpit of her fighter and watched the tactical display light up with target indicators as the Kresh fleet tried desperately to regroup after the initial human assault her squadron of 12 fighters had launched. From the UTCN, indomitable, the moment they entered weapons range, and now they streaked through the debris field like hunting hawks. Gold Squadron, this is Gold Leader, Sarah said into her CUM system, while her hands moved across the controls with practiced ease. Break by pairs and engage targets of opportunity, but watch for crossfire. The acknowledgments came back crisp and professional because her pilots had trained for this exact scenario in 100 simulations back at Titan Naval Academy. The difference was that simulations never quite captured the visceral reality of combat, or the weight of knowing that real lives depended on every decision. You made Sarah picked her first target and locked onto a Kresh cruiser that was trying to bring its weapons around to fire on one of the human destroyers. Thumbed the trigger and felt her fighter shudder as missiles leaped from their rails and crossed the distance in seconds. The Kresh cruiser's point defense systems tried to track the incoming missiles, but human munitions were designed to defeat. Countermeasures that had been refined over centuries of warfare on Earth 2 missiles made. It threw and detonated against the cruiser's hull, with enough force to crack it open like an atmosphere. And debris spilled into the void while the cruiser tumbled out of formation and its crew scrambled for escape pods Gold 3 and 4. "I need you on that destroyer, bearing 270. Sarah called out while already hunting for her next target. "It is trying to run for the edge of the system. Copy, Gold Leader. We are on it," came the reply from Lieutenant Martinez, whose fighter was already accelerating toward the fleeing Kresh. Vessel Sarah allowed herself a moment of pride because her squadron was performing exactly as they had been trained, despite this being most of their first real combat experience. Human military did not believe in sending people into battle unprepared, because Earth's long history of warfare had taught them that training saved lives. Every pilot in Gold Squadron had logged thousands of hours in simulators that replicated everything from engine failures to direct hits from enemy fire they had practiced. Combat maneuvers until their bodies could execute them, without conscious thought, even under the crushing G-forces that came with high speed. Maneuvering Sarah pulled her fighter into a vertical climb relative to the combat plane and got a better view of the overall battle. The UTCN destroyers were carving through the Kresh formation with ruthless efficiency, and their railguns reached out across impossible distances to punch holes through pirate vessels. The human ships moved in, coordinated patterns that looked almost choreographed, but were actually the result of neural link technology that allowed bridge crews to share tactical data in real time. Each ship knew exactly where every other ship was and what they were doing, which meant the human fleet fought as a single unified entity instead of individual vessels. The Kresh were learning a painful lesson about the difference between a mob of pirates and an actual military force. "Gold Leader, this is Indomitable Actual." Captain Vasquez's voice came through Sarah's cum and pulled her attention back to the immediate situation. "We are picking up a distress signal from the Kresh flagship, but the source is moving toward the colony." Sarah checked her sensors and saw that the Bone Render had detached several smaller craft that were now burning hard toward the Velic habitats. "They are going to try and take hostages," she said, and felt anger surge through her chest like hot metal, tempting to create leverage for negotiation. "That is what I am thinking too, Commander," Vasquez replied, and her voice carried steel underneath the calm exterior. "I need Gold Squadron to intercept those craft before they reach the colony on it, Captain," Sarah said, and switched to squadron frequency. "Gold Squadron, form on me. We have hostile craft inbound to the colony, and our job is to make sure they never get there." Her fighters broke from their individual engagements and formed up in a tight combat formation that would have been impossible for most species to maintain at these velocities. Humans had evolved with binocular vision and depth perception because their ancestors needed to judge distances perfectly while swinging through trees or throwing spears at prey. That same evolutionary advantage translated into pilots who could judge relative velocities and intercept angles with intuitive precision. The Kresh assault craft were fast, but they were not military grade, and they were carrying boarding parties, which meant they could not maneuver as aggressively. Sarah's squadron cut across their vector like a blade, and her targeting computer locked onto the lead craft weapons free. She ordered, and her fighters opened up with everything they had. Mass driver rounds and missiles filled the space between the two groups, and the Kresh craft had no chance against dedicated human interceptors. 3. The assault craft exploded immediately, and the others tried to scatter, but Gold Squadron was already among them. Sarah matched velocity with one craft and saw the hull was covered in crude armor plating welded over the original structure. She could see the fear in the Kresh pilot's movements as he tried desperately to evade, but human fighters were built for exactly this kind of close-quarters combatter. Targeting computer achieved lock, and she squeezed the trigger one more time. The assault craft came apart, and she was already moving to the next target before the debris had finished spreading. Gold 7 and 8. You have to craft braking for the asteroid belt, she called out while tracking her own targets. Do not let them reach cover. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes, and when it was over, every Kresh assault craft had been destroyed or disabled. Sarah took a moment to breathe and felt the adrenaline starting to fade from her system, leaving behind the familiar trembling that always came after combat. Indomitable actual, this is gold leader, she reported while checking her fuel and ammunition status. All hostile assault craft neutralized and the colony is secure. Good work, Commander, Vasquez replied, and Sarah could hear the relief in her captain's voice. Return to the ship and prep for recovery operations. Sarah guided her fighter back toward the Indomitable and looked at the tactical display. One more time, the Kresh fleet was scattered and broken with more than half their vessels. It's destroyed or crippled the surviving pirates. We're trying to flee in every direction, but the human destroyers were systematically hunting them down with the patient efficiency of apex predators. On the bridge of the Indomitable, Captain Vasquez stood at the command station and watched the battle reach its conclusion. Her tactical officer called out status reports in a steady stream that spoke of enemy vessels destroyed and friendly ships. Maintaining combat effectiveness, Captain. We are receiving a transmission from the Kresh flagship, the communications officer said. Pirate Lord Krathix is requesting terms for surrender. Vasquez felt no satisfaction in the request because she knew what kind of man Krathix was, and what he had done to countless colonies over his career put him on screen. She ordered the forward display flickered and showed Krathix sitting in what was left of his command throne with smoke and emergency lighting, creating shadows across his scarred face. Captain Vasquez, he said, and his voice had lost all its arrogant confidence. I surrender my fleet and request safe passage for my surviving ships under Galactic conventions regarding prisoners of war. Vasquez stared at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was cold enough to freeze hydrogen. You attacked a civilian colony and were planning to take hostages, she said, and watched him flinch. You do not get to invoke conventions you have spent your entire career violating. I have rights under galactic law. Krathix protested, but there was desperation creeping into his words. You will stand trial for your crimes, Vasquez replied and signaled her tactical officer. Disable his remaining ships and prepare boarding teams. She cut the transmission before he could respond and turned to her crew. I want every surviving Kresh vessel boarded and secured, she ordered while checking the status of the Velik colony. Document everything you find because I want a complete record for the tribunal. Her officers moved to comply, and Vasquez allowed herself a moment to feel the weight of command. They had come here to save lives, and they had succeeded, but the cost in destroyed ships and dead pirates would generate reports and inquiries for months. Galactic Council would demand explanations and file formal protests. About excessive force and violation of engagement protocols, Vasquez did not care because she had learned long ago that saving lives mattered more than following rules that were designed by species who had never known real war. The human fleet established a secure perimeter around the Velik colony and began rescue operations for any survivors floating in the debris field. Even among the Kresh ships, there would be crew members who deserved a chance to live and face justice. Was another lesson humans had learned from their bloody history on Earth. Victory in battle did not mean abandoning mercy or becoming the monsters you fought against. It meant doing what was necessary to protect the innocent, and then dealing with the consequences afterward. Dr. Lisa Park stepped off the transport shuttle and into the main habitat of Velik colony. Seven with her medical team behind her and their equipment floating on anti-gravity sleds. The habitat showed signs of the bombardment. Da-da-da-da-da-da, everywhere she looked, with cracked walls hastily sealed with emergency foam and scorch marks where plasma fire had breached the outer hull. But what struck her most was the sight of the Velik colonists themselves. They were small creatures, barely reaching her waist, with chitinous exoskeletons that gleamed in shades of green and blue under the emergency lighting. Their large compound eyes tracked her movement with what looked like a mixture of hope and fear. I am Dr. Park from the UTCN Indomitable, she said through her translator device while keeping her voice gentle and her movements slow. We are here to provide medical assistance, the Velik elder, who had been coordinating with Captain Vasquez, stepped forward and his antenna trembled. With emotion, Dr. Park, our medical facilities were damaged in the attack, he said, and his translated voice carried notes of exhaustion that transcended species. We have many injured and our healers do not know how to treat the wounds caused by Kresh weapons. Lisa nodded and signaled her team to begin setting up their field hospital in the main chamber. Human military medical units were designed to operate anywhere from zero gravity to heavy G worlds and could handle everything from radiation Exposure to combat trauma. Show me your most critical patients first, she said to the elder while pulling on her diagnostic gloves. We will work our way through everyone who needs treatment. The elder led her to a section of the habitat that had been converted into a makeshift infirmary where dozens of Velic lay on improvised beds. Lisa began her examination of the first patient and discovered that Velic physiology was actually simpler than human anatomy. In many ways, their chitinous exoskeletons provided natural armor, but when breached, the internal organs were vulnerable to infection and hemorrhaging. She worked quickly and efficiently while her hands moved through procedures she had practiced thousands of times in training and field deployments. The Velic healer who assisted her watched with growing amazement as Lisa sealed wounds with biofoam and administered broad-spectrum antibiotics from her medical kit. Your medicines work on our biology, the healer asked while helping stabilize a patient with severe plasma burns. Human medical science evolved to deal with a planet that was constantly trying to kill us, Lisa explained while checking the patient's vital signs. We had to develop treatments that could handle everything from bacterial infections to radiation poisoning. She moved to the next patient and found a young Velic who could not have been more than a few cycles old based on the size and coloration of his exoskeleton. The child had been caught near a hull breach when it happened, and the explosive decompression caused internal damage. Lisa worked on him with special care because, regardless of species, children deserved every chance to survive and grow her. A team spread through the habitat and treated patient after patient with the systematic efficiency that came from training and experience. The Velic healers watched and learned, and gradually began to understand that human medicine was designed for worst-case scenarios, and Earth doctors had to deal with diseases that evolved as fast as their treatments and injuries from a gravity. Well, that broke bones like twigs. That same harsh environment had produced medical technology that could treat almost anything if applied quickly. Enough hours passed, and Lisa felt the familiar ache in her back and hands that came from extended surgery, but she pushed through because there were still patients who needed help. She was just finishing with a colonist who had suffered severe lacerations when alarms sounded throughout the habitat. What is happening? She asked the elder, who had appeared at her side with anxiety radiating. From every antenna movement, a Galactic Council fleet has arrived, he replied while checking a datapad. They are requesting permission to dock. Lisa felt irritation flare because she knew what was coming, and she had seen it happen before on other worlds where human forces had intervened. The Galactic Council was excellent at showing up after the fighting was over and then criticizing how the humans had conducted themselves. She cleaned up and headed back to her shuttle while her team continued treating patients because Captain Vasquez would need her. Senior officers for whatever diplomatic disaster was about to unfold on the bridge of the indomitable Captain Vasquez stood at attention while the Galactic Council delegation filed into her briefing room. Commander Vex led the group, and his four hands moved in gestures that Lisa's cultural training identified as distress or disapproval. Captain Vasquez. Vex began, and his voice carried formal stiffness. The Galactic Council has reviewed the combat recordings from your engagement with the Kresh Swarm, and Vasquez asked while keeping her expression neutral. Your use of force was excessive and violated multiple engagement protocols. Vex continued, while pulling up holographic displays that showed the destroyed Kresh vessels. The Council cannot condone such aggressive military action. Vasquez felt anger building in her chest, but she kept her voice level and professional. Commander, the Velic colony was under attack by a force that outnumbered us nearly 6-1, she said while gesturing at the tactical data. My responsibility was to neutralize the threat and save civilian lives. You destroyed over 30 vessels. Another council member interjected, and his crystalline face showed shock. That level of destruction is unprecedented in modern galactic conflicts. The Kresh fleet attacked us first and refused to surrender when ordered, Vasquez replied, and now her voice had an edge. What exactly should I have done differently? Perhaps a more measured response, Dex suggested, while his hands moved in calming gestures. Warning shots or disabling fire to demonstrate capability, without causing such widespread destruction. Vasquez stared at him for a long moment and then pulled up her own holographic display showing the timeline of the battle. The Kresh opened fire on us the moment we arrived, she said while pointing at the data. They were attempting to breach the colony and take hostages even as we engaged their main fleet. She brought up recordings from the colony's sensors that showed the assault craft Sarah's squadron had intercepted these. Are not a military force interested in negotiation, Commander Thex? Vasquez continued, and her voice had gone cold. These are pirates who have terrorized this region for decades. While the council debated protocols, the briefing room fell silent, except for the background hum of the ship's systems Thex looked at. The tactical data, and Lisa saw something shift in his expression as he understood the reality of what had happened. The Velik would have been slaughtered if we had waited for council approval, Vasquez said, and now her voice carried finality. I made the decision to engage, and I accept full responsibility for that decision. Before Thex could respond, the doors to the briefing room opened, and the Velik elder walked in with several of his people behind him. Forgive the intrusion, Captain Vasquez, the elder said while his antenna moved in patterns that Lisa recognized as determination. But I heard the council was questioning your actions, Elder Thaven. This is a military matter. Thex began, but the Velik cut him off with a gesture. This is a matter of our survival, Commander Thex, the elder said, and his translated voice carried strength despite his small stature. The humans answered our call when no one else would act. He moved to the holographic display and pulled up images of the colony showing the damaged habitats and improvised memorials for those who had died in the bombardment. We sent distress calls for 3 days, while the council debated and discussed protocols. Elder Thaven continued, and Lisa heard anger creeping into his words. The Kresh were hours away from breaching our habitats and killing everyone. Dex opened his mouth to respond, but the elder was not finished. Captain Vasquez and her fleet arrived and fought for us, he said while turning to face the council delegation. They bled for us, and some of them died to protect people they had never met. Lisa had not known there were human casualties, and she felt sorrow mixed with pride the humans did not ask for permission, or file reports, or wait for committees to convene. Elder Thaven said, and his voice grew stronger. They saw people in danger, and they acted because that is who they are. He moved to stand beside Vasquez, and his small form barely reached her elbow, but his presence filled the room. If the council wishes to condemn the humans for saving us, then the Velik people will withdraw from the galactic community, the elder said, and his words carried absolute conviction, because we will not remain part of an organization that values protocols more than lives. The council delegation exchanged glances. Lessa saw uncertainty in their movements. Thex looked at the tactical data one more time, and then at the recordings of the damaged colony and the grateful survivors, perhaps. He said slowly while his hands moved in gestures of concession, perhaps the situation required a response that falls outside normal parameters. The humans did what was necessary, Elder Thaven replied. That is not excessive force, Commander Thex. That is salvation. The council delegation withdrew shortly after, and Lisa watched them go with mixed feelings. She knew this would not be the end of the controversy, and there would be reports and inquiries and formal protests filed by various member species. 3 weeks after the battle at Velik, Colony 7 Commander, Thex sat in the Galactic Council chamber and watched the proceedings with emotions he could not quite identify. The chamber was packed with representatives from dozens of species, and the air hummed with translated conversations and the rustle of various appendages against seating designed to accommodate wildly different physiologists. Topic of debate was what had become known as the Velik incident, and whether the human military's response should be condemned or accepted. As Precedenthics had spent those 3 weeks reviewing every piece of evidence and every tactical recording, and slowly coming to understand something that challenged everything he thought he knew about. Military Doctrine Ambassador Quellen stood at the central podium with her crystalline form reflecting the chamber lights and patterns that spoke of agitation. The human response violated no fewer than 8 separate protocols regarding proportional force, she argued, while holographic displays showed the destroyed Kresh vessels. We cannot allow such aggressive action to become normalized. The Kresh swarm has been terrorizing the outer colonies for generations, countered a representative from the Arcs and Systems, whose people had suffered from pirate raids. Perhaps if the Council had acted with similar decisiveness decades ago, those colonies would still be inhabited. The debate continued, and listened to both sides make their arguments, while his mind kept returning to the recordings he had watched. He had seen Captain Vasquez's fleet drop out of FTL at combat speed that would have killed most species and engage a force 6 times. Their number, without hesitation, he had watched human fighters move through the battle space with precision that defied conventional tactics and destroy assault craft that were heading towards civilian targets. He had read the medical reports from Dr. Park about treating injuries that the Velic healers could not, and seen the casualty numbers that would have been catastrophic without human intervention. Most importantly, he had spoken with Elder Thaven and dozens of other Velic colonists who were alive only because humans had answered their distress call. "If I may address the council," Vex said, and rose from his seat while his 4 hands moved in the gesture requesting permission to speak. Chamber fell silent, and Ambassador Quellen gestured for him to approach the podium. Thex moved to the center of the chamber and looked at the assembled representatives from species across the known galaxy. "I was one of the first to receive the Velic distress call," he began, and his voice carried clearly through the translation systems. "I sat in this chamber for 3 days while we debated protocols and jurisdictions and proper procedures." He brought up the holographic display showing the timeline of events. From the first distress call to the arrival of the human fleet, the Velic colony would have fallen within 48 hours of their initial call. He continued, while highlighting the critical window, "Our nearest peacekeeping fleet was 4 weeks away." Vex turned to face Ambassador Quellen directly, and his hands moved in gestures that indicated respectful disagreement. "We sat here discussing proportional response and diplomatic considerations while people died," he said, and felt the weight of that truth. The humans did not wait for permission, because permission would have arrived too late. He pulled up combat recordings from the battle and let them play for several seconds before pausing on an image of a human destroyer intercepting fire that had been aimed at the colony. "The humans did not use excessive force, Ambassador Quillen," Vex said, and his voice grew stronger. "They used the minimum force necessary to neutralize a threat that outnumbered them 6 to 1 and was actively attempting to take civilian hostages." Another council member rose to object, but Vex gestured. "For patience, I have spent 3 weeks reviewing human military doctrine and history," he continued while bringing up comparative data. "Humans come from a world where survival required constant vigilance and overwhelming response to threats." The holographic display shifted to show images of Earth with its extreme weather patterns and dangerous megafauna and viral diseases that evolved at terrifying rates. They developed military tactics over thousands of years of warfare among themselves, Vex explained while the data scrolled past. "Their concept of proportional force is based on ensuring victory with minimum casualties." He brought up the final casualty numbers from the Velic battle and let them speak for themselves. "The human fleet suffered 3 dead and 17 wounded," he said while highlighting those numbers. "The Velic colony lost 47 colonists in the bombardment before the humans arrived." They paused and looked around the chamber at the representatives who were watching with varying degrees of interest or hostility. "If we had followed our protocols and waited for proper authorization and assembled a peacekeeping fleet, the Velic colony would have lost thousands," he said, and let that sink in. "Every single colonist would likely be dead or enslaved." Ambassador Quillen's crystalline form pulsed with agitation, but she did not interrupt the human's answer to distress call and saved lives. Dex continued, and his hands moved in gestures of emphasis. They did so knowing they would face council censure and formal protests and months of inquiries. He brought up one final recording from the battle, and it showed Captain Vasquez on her bridge making the decision to engage without council authorization. "Captain Vasquez made a choice that I believe defines the difference between human military thinking and our own," Dex said while the recording played. "She chose action over protocol and lives over procedures." The chamber remained silent as Dex returned to his seat and let his words resonate through the council. After a long moment, a new voice spoke up. "From the section reserved for outer colony representatives, the Velic are not the only colony the humans have aided," said a Theshan diplomat whose trade worlds bordered human space. "There are dozens of incidents where human patrols responded to distress calls and engaged hostile forces." She brought up her own data showing a pattern of human intervention. "Across the frontier regions where council authority was weakest, the humans have a reputation among the outer colonies." she continued while the data displayed. When you call for help, they answer and they do not wait for permission. Other representatives began to speak up, and Dex realized something was shifting in the chamber, the outer colonies and frontier worlds. Were not afraid of human aggression because they had seen it directed at pirates and raiders and slavers who terrorized regions the Council could not effectively protect, perhaps, said a veteran military officer from the Arxan Defense Force. Perhaps we should be asking why human military doctrine is so effective rather than condemning it for being different from our own. The debate continued for hours, but Dex could feel the momentum changing as more voices spoke in support of human intervention. 3 days later, the Council voted to neither condemn nor formally approve human military actions, but instead to establish what became known as the Vasquez Protocol. Named after the captain who had sparked the debate, it allowed for immediate military response to distress calls when lives were at imminent risk and formal authorization could not be obtained in time. Protocol included provisions for after-action review and accountability, but recognized that sometimes action was more important than following established procedures. Dex found himself assigned to help draft the guidelines and implementation procedures because of his involvement in the Velic incident. He spent long hours working with human military advisors who helped explain their tactical thinking and decision-making processes. What emerged was a compromise between human direct action and galactic careful deliberation that acknowledged the value of both approaches. 6 weeks after the battle, Captain Vasquez stood on the observation deck of the Indomitable and looked at the stars beyond the viewport. Commander Vex had requested a private meeting before the human fleet departed to continue its patrol duties. Captain Vasquez, Dex said as he entered the observation deck with his 4 hands moving in gestures of respect. I wanted to speak with you before you leave, Commander Dex, Vasquez replied and turned to face him. I assume this is about the Council's decision in part. Vex admitted while moving to stand beside her at the viewport. The Vasquez Protocol will change how the galactic community responds to emergencies. Vasquez nodded, but her expression remained neutral because she knew that protocols and policies meant little without the will to implement them. Your species terrifies the Council, Vex said quietly, and his translated voice carried notes of honesty. You are too aggressive and too quick to violence, and too willing to risk everything I know. Vasquez replied, and her dark eyes reflected the starlight. We hear that constantly from other species, but you also saved the Velic colony when no one else could. Vex continued and turned to face her directly. You answered their distress call and fought for people you had never met. He paused, and his hands moved in gestures that indicated respect and something like admiration. I spent 3 days sitting in a comfortable chamber debating protocols while people died, he said, and Vasquez heard genuine regret in his voice. You spent 2 days pushing your ships and crews to their limits to reach them in time,